The final part of Module 7 is about the question how we can help language learners to develop intercultural competence. In the first part, two well-known theoretical models are briefly presented, the iceberg model of culture and Michael Byram's model of intercultural communicative competence. The second part deals with some practical implications for the classroom and also includes the presentation of a task which might promote ICC in various educational contexts. One of the most well-known models is the so-called iceberg model of culture, which was developed initially by the anthropologist Edward T. Hall in 1976. Culture is often compared to an iceberg, which has both visible and invisible parts. Above the surface, there are elements of culture which we can plainly see, for example, food and clothes, architecture, pieces of art or festivals. But this is only a small part of culture. Below the surface, there's a much larger part, the invisible elements of culture. This hidden part of culture includes beliefs and values, customs and traditions, which are also reflected in the culture's concepts about relationships, about the past and the future, or about life and death. When one first enters a new culture, for example as a tourist, only the most obvious cultural elements are visible. But as one spends more time in that new culture, the underlying concepts and thought patterns which influence the upper part are uncovered. Hall suggests that we must actively interact with members of the other culture if we want to understand the values and beliefs that underlie the society. In a way, the upper and lower part of the iceberg are also reflected in a well-known distinction that was made by Raymond Williams. Culture with a capital C versus culture with a small c. Culture with a capital C refers to that part of culture which is most visible, for example art, literature and music or national holidays and festivals. When learning about new culture, the big C cultural elements are typically encountered first. In foreign language textbooks, we often find units which provide a lot of factual knowledge, for example about tourist attractions in London. Culture with a small c is less visible and is reflected in communication styles, cultural symbols, or how people behave in general in everyday life and how they interact. In the context of language learning, the concept of intercultural communicative competence was developed in the 1990s and became very popular through the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages. The development of ICC includes the development of numerous competences. Learners need to develop language skills and communicative skills as well as sociolinguistic and pragmatic skills. In addition to this, they must also develop skills in observing, describing, explaining, and evaluating culture. The detailed specification of ICC is still an ongoing project. However, much work has been accomplished in this area by Michael Byram and his colleagues. In his model, ICC is conceived of as a set of knowledge, skills, and attitudes. In total, there are 5 so-called savoirs, as Byram calls them, which can be summarized as follows. The attitudes do not necessarily have to be positive, but learners need to be able to decenter from their own position and to change perspectives. They also need to develop attitudes of openness and curiosity and value the attitudes and beliefs of others. Knowledge would include, for example, factual knowledge about the other culture, for example, about the history, geography, or society. This could be either culture with a capital or with a small c. The skills of interpreting and relating meaning refer to texts or events from another culture, which can be explained and related to similar texts or events from one's own culture. Learners also need to develop skills of discovery and social interaction to be able to recognize significant cultural phenomena or significant patterns in social interaction. Finally, another important goal is to develop critical awareness towards the other culture, as well as towards one's own culture. This is a process which may be guided by the teacher. Critical cultural awareness can be created through tasks in the classroom. Schocker and Müller-Hartmann suggested a model for developing tasks in ICC that involve 4 different steps. The first step would be to motivate and involve learners and make them curious for another culture, perhaps also by activating their pre-knowledge. In a second step, they need to become aware of their own cultural practices, which might be part of their subconscious knowledge to a large extent, of course. The third stage of the task would be to change perspectives and to discover and try to understand the different cultural practices. The fourth stage would involve a comparison of cultural practices in both cultures and the discovery of similarities and differences between both cultures. A task, or rather a project, that may be helpful to promote ICC and that follows the steps suggested in the model by Byram and in the model by Schocker and Müller-Hartmann is the telecollaboration project Culture in a Box. The main idea is that 2 or more groups of learners from different cultures select and exchange items which they think might represent their culture very well, and therefore might be of interest for the learners of the other culture. In order to make learners curious about the other culture, the different groups of learners may first of all start an email exchange and introduce themselves to each other. During the second stage, each group reflects on their own cultural practices. In this case, they would have to think about specific objects which might represent their own culture. For example, typical household items, cultural symbols, or food items. All objects are collected and put into a box, which is then sent to the other learners. Then the boxes are exchanged and each group discusses the items they have received individually, and they try to find out what the objects represent and why they were chosen. During the final stage, each group may ask specific questions concerning the items, and then the items are explained by their partners. It is also possible to compare the items and to try to find out about similarities and differences. So what are the general implications for the classroom? In general, it seems necessary to set both language goals as well as goals for cultural exploration and mediation. This also requires an insight that language and culture are interrelated, and that it is absolutely necessary to reflect on one's own culture as well, and to encourage learners to change perspectives in order to increase the acceptability of the other culture's preferences. In this way, in the long run, mutual understanding might be increased and stereotypes might be avoided. Ultimately, the idea is that language learners become so-called intercultural speakers, a term used by Michael Byram and Claire Cramsch. Intercultural speakers have developed intercultural communicative competence and possess linguistic, sociolinguistics, and pragmatic competences that allow them to serve as mediators between both cultures, not only because they have the necessary linguistic means, but also because they are familiar with the cultural practices on both sides.